The new Switch release of Tomb Raider should on paper be the ultimate console version of developer Crystal Dynamics' 2013 series reboot, but visually speaking it does fall short. Having shadow dropped this month on both Switch 2 and also the original Switch, this conversion comes courtesy of Aspyr, the studio publisher behind the recent Tomb Raider 1-3 and 4-6 remasters. It comes in at 27GB in size on both Switch consoles and impressively includes the 8-player multiplayer component as well. Further good news is that Switch 2 targets and comfortably hits 60 frames per second in the main story mode. Really, I've had barely any drops from the first few hours of play, either playing Switch 2 docked or as a handheld. Except to reach that 60fps performance level, the game is obviously cut back compared to the PlayStation 4 Definitive Edition release on which this is based, and more glaringly, the original PS3 version as well. So, in turn, let's see how Switch 2 compares to those older versions, and what's up with the original Switch's delivery of the game.
The Black Friday discount season is upon us, with MSI bringing some of its biggest savings ever. Get up to 45% off MSI displays, including their critically acclaimed QD OLEDs like the MPG 272 URX and the MPG 321 URXW, and get a free Borderlands game code when you buy from selected partners. And there's more. Grab up to £100 in Steam codes with select RTX 50 series graphics cards and up to £70 off MSI motherboards, cases and coolers while stocks last. Click the link in the video description below for more details.
First up, both Switch versions inherit the pros and cons of the Definitive Edition release on PS4 and Xbox One from back in 2014. Textures are improved over the PS3 version, foliage is rearranged across the jungles, and colour grading is tweaked for a more colourful, saturated look. The grittier aesthetic of the PS3 and 360 versions from 2013 still has its appeal, and as I'll get to this day, they offer some visual upsides which aren't included today on Switch 2. To kick off then, in comparison with base PS4, Nintendo's latest console gets off to a solid start by rendering at a native 1920 by 1080 resolution while docked. There's no sign of dynamic resolution scaling, there's also no temporal anti-aliasing in use, so stair-stepping is treated with a more conventional AA technique here. So, it matches the base PS4 version's own native fixed 1080p image closely in these respects. Curiously, Switch 2 in portable mode also appears to render natively at 1080p, meaning there's no real image quality boost in reserve for docked play, despite more GPU and memory bandwidth being on tap there. No doubt, you'll have already spotted visual differences between these two, so let's start with the big one. That shadow coverage is greatly stripped back across the jungle on Switch 2. It's best to stop and show this flipping between the two versions in full screen. In a nutshell, the Switch 2 version removes shadow detail for some trees overhead, many are missing, while in some cases the shadows that remain are entirely static. On top of that, ambient occlusion, the shading in and around foliage, the undersides of trees, and Lara's character model is also seemingly pared back. The result is a dramatically lighter image on Switch 2 here, with so much depth removed in the absence of that shading. And finally, it's impossible to overlook that foliage density is also cut back on Switch 2. It's not always a huge difference in foliage, but where the cutbacks appear, it only serves to make these areas look even more sparse. To its credit, Switch 2 keeps most shadows in place. It's just not as extensively applied to the entire area, leaving obvious empty patches across the ground. To compound the issue, those shadows run at a lower quality preset on Switch 2, with softer, less precise detailing of each leaf on cliff sides in this initial area. So even to this day, the 9-year-old PS4 release is producing a vastly better, more richly detailed rendition of the scene. Another key feature lost on Switch 2 is the Tress Effects setting, a strand-based hair physics system added to the PS4 version. Note how on PS4 each hair strand splays outward as Lara climbs up in this shot, whereas both Switch releases defer to the simplified hair physics of the older PS3 release. Tress Effects is disabled, meaning the ponytail sways behind her just as a single clump, rather than strand by strand, another big cutback. Next along, in cutscenes, post-processing tricks like depth of field are massively dialed back on Switch 2, while the bloom effect haloing fire effects is also less pronounced. Also, on long stretches in the jungle, foliage LODs are reined in, with branches fading in a dithered fashion on Switch 2, while they're often fully rendered at range on PS4. And last of all, geometry is also lowered a setting on Switch 2, meaning the rocks circling the campfire here use a simplified geometric mesh. Again, best to show this one flipping back and forth. Most of those last points are more nitpicky in nature, but the shadow and foliage cutbacks do really stick out. Perhaps most surprising is how Switch 2 stacks up to the even older PlayStation 3 release. The 2013 PS3 original has a few advantages over even the PS4 Definitive Edition, in fact, which by extension also applies to Switch 2. This version has a more muted colour palette, and while the 720p image on PS3 is rough by today's standards, it's still one of the more technically accomplished releases for the system. All of which is to say, looking back, Switch 2 loses out on a few details it could have potentially reclaimed. A screen space rain effect is present on PS3, allowing droplets to hit the screen, which is axed on base PS4 and Switch 2. Likewise, a rain splatter effect on the tops of plants is removed. Again, this isn't on the Definitive Edition on PS4 in the opening jungle, and so it doesn't translate to Switch 2 either. Most damning of all is that PS3 has better shadow coverage in spots, while geometry quality is also higher, taking those campfire rocks as an example. Switch 2 has the better textures and some added foliage elements, but the drawbacks are disappointing given the multi-generational divide between the systems. Ultimately, for all the cutbacks, there's one advantage on Switch 2, a stable 60 FPS based on the opening few hours. Perhaps a 30 FPS quality mode option running at those higher visual settings, similar to base PS4's, or even a 40 FPS option in handheld mode would have been a good alternative here. Instead, Switch 2 offers a single way to play at 60 FPS, and it's locked 99% of the time, which is great news at least. At worst, Switch 2 has a dip into the 50s during a cutscene at a camp, but this is really the worst case scenario. In combat, it's rare to see it go under the line. Also, while the visual downgrades from base PS4 are a disappointment, it's key to stress that base PS4 to this day struggles to run well. In comparison, Switch 2 is an upgrade in overall stability at 60, while PS4 runs at between 40 to 60 FPS most of the time, with dips under that at points. This unlocked wavering reading is straightened out today by running the game on PS4 Pro or PS5 hardware of course, but it's a reminder of just how woeful last-gen optimization for the game was on base hardware. This should have been a lot better for the console release in 2014, and on Switch 2 today, for all its trade-offs in visual detail, it's at least put right. A final word on the original Switch version. Fundamentally, the Tegra X1 at the heart of the OG Switch demands a few extra cutbacks, the standout one being that it runs at 30 FPS rather than 60. In terms of resolution, it's pushing a surprisingly respectable 864p to 900p. There's some minor DRS adjustments at play here, causing the pixel structure to adjust, but all things considered, 900p isn't exactly a drastic drop below Switch 2's 1080p. In direct comparison, it's prone to slightly more aliasing, though it holds up surprisingly well. And also, good news is that all textures, effects, geometry, and foliage density is a match for the newer Switch. However, there is a further drop in shadow quality. Across the ground and cliff sides, there's much more obvious pixelation and flicker to shadows than Switch 2's already compromised setting. This is easily the most noticeable visual setting downgrade for the original Switch. On top of that, there's minor differences in the LOD range for foliage on the OG Switch, with more obvious pop-in on long straights ahead. On the whole though, besides the flickering shadows, it holds up much better than you might expect. In framerate testing on the original Switch, performance at 30 FPS is clearly a sticking point. To be blunt, the hardware is overstretched even at this half refresh. Mostly it is fine in gameplay, there are some frame pacing issues at the 30 FPS line, but cutscenes with multiple characters on screen trigger some dips into the 20s. Likewise, in shootouts, it starts wavering under 30 FPS, making aiming infinitely harder than Switch 2's smooth 60 FPS line. All evidence here points to a CPU bottleneck issue, since the frame rate immediately jumps back to 30 FPS once all enemies are killed off, and their body physics disengage. Effectively, Switch's performance has parallels with the original PS3 release, which itself aimed for 30 with similar frame pacing issues. On balance, it's better than the PS3 version in most other combat scenes, but the issue is it's still dropping to the mid-20s much too often. That's the lowdown for the Tomb Raider 2013 reboot on Switch 1 and 2. The key point is that Switch 2 is missing a large chunk of detailing across its jungles, notably in shadows, which puts it below base PS4 settings. For anyone wanting to play the game at its best today, Switch 2 sadly isn't the definitive console release as it stands, though having it run at a solid 60 FPS is obviously a plus. On a more general level, and following the sequence of Tomb Raider remasters from Aspyr as of late, it does heavily suggest that we might see Rise of the Tomb Raider and Shadow of the Tomb Raider on Switch 2 later on. Being far more complex efforts, with ray tracing support in the third game, there's a lot of questions surrounding how, in theory, those might translate. For now, Tomb Raider Definitive Edition shows a real mixture of pros and cons on Switch 2, and could benefit, I think, from an alternative 30 FPS quality mode to help reinstate some of those missing visual features. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. Please do check out our Patreon to support us at Digital Foundry, and to get in touch directly with myself or the team, you know where to find us. But from me for now, thanks for watching.